Joining us today on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. I am Jeffrey Rosen. I am the president and CEO of this wonderful institution, the National Constitution Center. The Constitution Center is the only institution in the country chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And today we're gathering for a special new program. We call them Town Hall Tuesdays. And these are events that are on the news, both historic and contemporary. We pick the topics just a few weeks in advance so that we can engage the best arguments on all sides of the constitutional arguments of the moment. It is hard to think of a more constitutionally significant anniversary than the one we commemorate today, the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. It was November 19th, 1863, where President Lincoln intended to give remarks as part of the official dedication ceremony for the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, one of the bloodiest and most decisive days of the Civil War. He was not the featured orator, but he gave a brief address, 273 words, that would be remembered as one of the most important speeches in American history. We've handed out copies of the address. I hope all of you have it. It's short. We'll read it together, and we're going to parse the text closely to explore both the political, historical, and constitutional significance of this transformative document in American constitutional history. I am thrilled to join those who are joining us by live stream, and want to give a very special thank you to our dear partners and friends at the Constitutional Accountability Center. CAC is co-sponsoring this program, and we're so glad to have their support. At the end of the program, please visit our new exhibit about the Civil War. We have artifacts, including an original oil lamp from General Meade's Gettysburg headquarters and an original Confederate canteen lost in the heat of the battle. Also, we're displaying a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Lincoln and a leaf from an autograph album that was used to gather signatures at the dedication of the Gettysburg ceremony. It's the only known signature of Lincoln. It's opening today and a fitting place to visit after our great discussion today. I want to thank the McLean contribution ship for their help in funding the program as well. My friends, I can't imagine a better, two people in the world I'd rather be having the discussion that we're about to have with. We're in for such a treat. These are two dear friends of mine. They're the leading scholars of Gettysburg and the meaning of equality and the Civil War in America. We have Akhil Amar from Yale Law School, the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale, one of the most accomplished constitutional scholars in the country. He was my constitutional law professor, and during the first week in law school, we debated the very question that you and I are going to be hearing Sean and Akhil debate today, namely, did the Civil War transform the meaning of popular sovereignty, and were we the people of the United States sovereign at the time of the founding, as some framers claimed, like James Wilson, or did it really take the Civil War to ensure a new birth of freedom that would make the people of the United States as a whole sovereign? I had this debate. This is what excited me about the Constitution many years ago, and it was Akhil who kindled my interest, and you're going to have the pleasure of hearing from him today. And he's joined by Sean Wilentz, the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton, one of the nation's most prominent historians. His historical scholarship has transformed our understanding of the political and social history of the United States. He gave a great talk on WHYY's Radio Times this morning. He's also a colleague of mine at the New Republic, where he's long been a contributing editor. So this is just going to be a great discussion. Before we begin, as I said, I want to focus on the text. And I think the best way to focus on the text is for us to read the Gettysburg Address together. And in fact, I can't imagine any possible way, better way of reading it together than to introduce our next speaker. And that's why it's with great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, that I invite you to hear the Gettysburg Address recited at the lectern by none other than President Abraham Lincoln. President Lincoln. Thank you for joining, sir. We're honored to be here. We're looking forward to hearing your remarks.
"Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, and thank you for joining us for our discussion. Please come back next year. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my great honor to introduce my friends and colleagues, Akhil Amar and Sean Wilentz. Gentlemen, you've heard President Lincoln deliver those immortal words, and we're going to parse them closely. But before we jump into the text, I want to ask, take us back to November 19th, 150 years ago. What was the political situation, what was the constitutional situation, and what would the audience who heard that brief address have made of it? Sean.
Well, the battle had been fought back in July. It was a turning point in the war. I mean, up to that point, the North had been not doing very well militarily. One loss after another. The fate of the Union looked very dire before that battle. That battle, which, as you Pennsylvanians will all know, repelled Lee's invasion of the North and seemed to turn the tide. However, by November, the war was still dragging on. There was no end in sight, really. Things were going better for the Union, but not terribly better. 1863 was also the year before an election year, much as this year is a year before. Well, not the same kind of election. But still, it was a year before a presidential election, and he had that on his mind as well. It was unclear, really, until very late in that campaign when Sherman took Atlanta that Lincoln would be reelected. So I think it was a time of disquiet and discomfort, and that's why the speech is such a ringing call to remember what the cause of the war is all about.
Akhil, what would the audience have made of it? Did they recognize its significance at the time?
So 7 score and 10 years ago. I just had to say that.
That was good. Hard to figure out.
There were 2 audiences, I think, as Sean just mentioned. There's the immediate group of folks who heard Lincoln in person. They were there to commemorate a portion of the battlefield. But of course, Lincoln is aware of the broader audience that is, in effect, listening in. Sean and I were talking just in the green room about this extraordinary new technology transformative in the way that, say, the internet and email have been transformed for us, the telegraph. So his words are being relayed across the country and indeed around the world in almost real time. There are people there, stenographers in effect, sort of capturing it word for word. There actually was a little debate about, because different versions, some of them had the words "under God," and not all of them did, but all the press accounts actually captured those words. So the larger audience, of course, is the American electorate, as Sean said, and indeed, ultimately, a world audience. And so it's very modern in that way. The government of the people, by the people, for the people, and we heard a proper emphasis on the noun rather than the prepositions, not of, by, and for, but the people shall not perish from the earth. He's trying to locate these events in world historical significance, trying to make the case to the electorate in the world. And I think Sean put it just right. You have to understand how this fits into the calendar. Okay? So 150 years later, we're not in a presidential election season because 150 doesn't divide by 4, but 100 does. And we were just talking right before in the green room. So think back, some of you who were around 50 years ago. Okay, that's the 100th anniversary. That does divide by 4. And another president is going, and he's leaving Washington, D.C. In late November, he goes to Dallas. What's that all about? That's the beginning of the campaign of '64 for Jack Kennedy. Okay? And I think in some very important ways, this is the beginning of the campaign of '64 for Abe Lincoln. His first term hasn't gone so well. There have been some early fiascos, and I use the word fiasco as in Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Battle of First Manassas. And so there's at least 3 audiences. There are the folks there, and it is said, the urban myth is that it was not well received in the moment by the audience. They're not true. He was interrupted by applause 5 times, I believe, according to the reports. And it's not that long a speech, and there are only 5 or 6 possible applause lines. They're not. This is a solemn event. You're putting bodies in the ground, and so this is not a place for sort of streamers and balloons. But to get interrupted 5 times in 273 words when there are not that many sentences, So I think it was well received at the time, contrary to what some of us might have sort of heard as a matter of legend. But ultimately, the ultimate test, I would say, is the national test and the world test. What's that all about? It's about whether he wins re-election, and he does, thumpingly, I think 212 to 21 in the Electoral College. This is the beginning of that. And does government of the people, by the people, for the people, perish from the earth? Emphatically not. In fact, the world today is far more democratic than it was at the founding or in Lincoln's time. So when you understand that his audience isn't just the people there, but the people across America and the world, and frankly, the people today, in time as well as space, yeah.
And just remember on the question of the world, the larger audience, I mean, democracy is not exactly flourishing in the world at the middle of the 19th century. The revolutions of 1848
have failed,
had been crushed or degenerated into various nationalisms. It does not look as if democracy as a proposition will exist anywhere in the world. He's not simply talking about American democracy. He's talking about democracy anywhere.
Yes. Whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure.
So this Civil War is a test not simply of our union and our nation. It's a test of a larger proposition of self-government, of democracy. And if it, in fact, fails here, it will fail everywhere. Yeah. And those are the stakes.
And that's why this is, testing. This is a testing ground. Right. We are being tested. Right. Whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And then he comes back to that at the end, shall not perish from the earth. We're the last best hope of earth, to borrow a phrase that I once heard from Mr. Lincoln. And so that's the cosmic significance of this. And so his audience is concentric. The people there, people in America, people of the world at the time, and ultimately the people of the world for all time.
Beautiful. Okay, so you've identified the context, you identified the audience and the scope. Let's delve into the text. And there are three large claims about the Constitution in the Gettysburg Address. The first is a claim about what the founders thought about liberty and equality. The second is the claim about a new birth of freedom after the Civil War. And the third is a claim about democracy. So let's take them up in order. Here's the first one. The President said it far more eloquently. I'll just read it again. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Sean, is that true, or was Lincoln rewriting the history of the founding?
Depends on what you mean by the founding. What Abraham Lincoln is doing here is drawing together, making as one organic whole, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Now, did the framers think of themselves as being organically connected to Thomas Jefferson and the men of 1776? Well, yes. You couldn't have had it without that. They are part of a long train that is trying at this point to create a more perfect union. So this is something that's been going on for a very long time. And it really does go back to 1776. So there is a reason to do it. By the same token, we do not judge we judge American law by the Constitution, not by the Declaration of Independence. Did the framers begin, or the founders, whatever you want to call them, believe in equality? Well, boy, oh boy, you're going to get an argument over that, all of the time. There's no question, though, that Lincoln sees in Jefferson, takes Jefferson at his word, as many Americans had begun to take Jefferson at his word. As different as David Walker, the slave insurrectionist in South Carolina, or up in Boston by the time he got there. Many others were beginning to take Jefferson at his word. Did Jefferson mean to be taken at his word? That's another matter. But the word, the idea that all men are created equal, had taken on a new life, and that was what Lincoln was speaking to.
Akhil, did the Gettysburg Address perfect the promise of the Declaration? We had here the other week the philanthropist David Rubenstein, who's lent us a very rare copy of the Declaration, and he said that the promise of Jefferson wasn't vindicated until Gettysburg. Is that right?
So just to, around the world we're marking this 150th anniversary, but just I want those of you who were kind enough to come, and thank you for coming, just to reflect a little bit on how we are in a very special place at this special hour. I would say there are three places on the planet that have a particularly organic connection to this moment. Gettysburg itself, the place where the Declaration and the Constitution, and frankly the Gettysburg Address, and the scripts are housed, the National Archives, and here in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were drafted. Okay, and Lincoln's is a profound meditation on the relationship between those two projects, the project of the Declaration and the Constitution. So of all the places in the world, this is a very special place to be, right here at Philadelphia Mall, sort of reflecting on the place that gave us both the Declaration and the Constitution. So from the beginning, there's just a connection because they come out of the same place, or so-called Independence Hall, and that was not lost. The biggest celebration in the New World up to that moment occurred on July 4th, 1788, here in Philadelphia. James Wilson actually gave remarks at that event, commemorating the fact that the Constitution has now been ratified by enough states that it will go into existence. 20,000 people, I think, show up for this. So there. And on what date? July 4th. Now remember, when is this testing taking place in the Battle of Gettysburg about the meaning of America? It's, the first week of July. The battle drags through July 4th, 1863, and it ends with the Union holding the field and the rebels running, abandoning the field, retreating. So there are all these amazing connections already between these two documents, and American history before this is a debate about the meaning of the Declaration and its relationship to the Constitution. And Sean put it just right. Are we going to take Mr. Jefferson, who lives and dies a slaveholder and never frees his slaves, are we going to take him at his word, which sounds soaring and great, or at his deed, which is genuinely embarrassing? It's not just that he doesn't free his slaves. He founds a pro-slavery party. And he said lots of great things against slavery early in his life, but then when he wants to be president, he founds a pro-slavery party. It's the dominant political party in America. So this Constitution, which doesn't ever mention the word slavery, leads to Jacksonian America, the dominant political figure in antebellum America. After Washington and before Lincoln is Andrew Jackson. It's the age of Jackson, and he calls himself a Democrat, and he's a slaveholder, and it's increasingly, it's a pro-slavery party, and the people that get put on the Supreme Court, through constitutional processes, that's the Dred Scott Court, and they say in Dred Scott, oh, pay no attention to the words, don't take Jefferson at his word. Actually, if you're going to, take him seriously, you would be a hypocrite if you took him at his word, and he couldn't be a hypocrite. So he didn't mean it that way. He meant it in a very different way. He meant, equality for whites, but not just slaves, not for blacks, not even for free blacks. This is a government of, by, and for the white people. So there's this debate, a conversation about what Jefferson meant, and Lincoln is, it's a brilliant move. He's claiming Jefferson even as he's co-opting and transforming the meaning of that in the same way that Barack Obama says nice things about Ronald Reagan sometimes as he's trying to destroy the Reagan coalition, the Reagan platform. As Ronald Reagan said nice things about FDR as he was trying to destroy the New Deal coalition. As FDR, said nice things about Lincoln, Lincoln's party is the dominant political, it's in the wilderness before 1860, but it's the dominant political party all the way through. Lincoln makes it so. So Lincoln, when he says those words, is it true at the time? It's true performatively. He's actually doing this. Or it gets done maybe not the day he says it, not the very instant he says, I do. That's the doing of the deed. But when he gets reelected, that's when the American people basically weigh in on this, and the South has opted out of the whole thing. So it's an election that's kind of in Lincoln's favor because the most extreme elements have removed themselves from the electoral conversation of 1863. So he wins, and then the Constitution is, and we're going to talk about this more, I hope, amended 3 times, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to codify Lincoln's vision. He talks about a birth of freedom. We're going to talk about people being born equal. The 13th Amendment is going to end slavery. Talk about a new birth of freedom, and Lincoln is going to be a big part of that. You saw the movie Lincoln. And the 15th Amendment is going to go even further in the direction of government of the people. So he's claiming Jefferson and transforming him and making Jefferson look a lot more benign, actually, in retrospect. In the same way, maybe, the final analogy, if you happen to be in a Christian tradition or something, the way Christ takes, earlier teachings and reinterprets them. He's a great rabbi, kind of profound way, and gives us a different way of thinking about the 10 Commandments.
Can I get one little clarification and a dissent?
Okay.
Excellent.
The clarification is Lincoln was not the first to do this, just to be clear.
Absolutely.
Anti-slavery politics by the 1840s, the Liberty Party, had already begun to make that association.
Yep.
So Lincoln is, in fact, building upon this. He's been saying this all through the 1850s in his speeches. So he's been referring to Jefferson, in fact, who is a Democrat. And, he's not of his party. He never said anything much nice about Jefferson until 1854. Then he becomes a Jeffersonian.
Why?
Well, because he reads in Jefferson's Declaration, precisely the thing that he has to do to justify his argument against slavery. It's at the root of his argument against slavery is that all men are created equal. I'm not sure that the democracy, Jackson's democracy, was pro-slavery. This is my dissent.
Okay. And you would know. He wrote the definitive book on Jacksonian democracy.
It's kind of anti-slavery. which is not quite the same thing. I know it sounds like a contradiction, but there are many Democrats who actually join with the Whigs in coalition in the anti-slavery coalition.
Simon P. Chase.
So there's a real argument going on, and what they're trying to do is suppress the issue of slavery. And what happens is that by the 1850s, when the Democratic Party does become a pro-slavery party, very definitely, then the whole thing just comes undone.
And you see the extreme...
And he's talking to that. I mean, Lincoln's talking to that.
Pro-slavery version with Roger Taney, against whom, see, Lincoln is running relentlessly. The Lincoln-Douglas debates are all about Dred Scott. And the irony of his being sworn in 1861 by Taney. But Taney has said, don't take the words of the Declaration seriously. That's in the Dred Scott opinion very, very prominently. And Taney says, not just do we have slavery, blacks, even free blacks, aren't and really can't be citizens if they're descended from slaves or part of a slave race. They really have no proper role in the American project. And Taney has gone so far as to render unconstitutional not just, in effect, the Republican Party platform of excluding slavery from the West. That's unconstitutional, according to Taney. You can't have free soil laws, according to Taney, who is put on the court by Andrew Jackson. But actually, even Douglas-style popular sovereignty let the individual territories decide. It's kind of ruled, out by Dred Scott. Even drawing a line in the sand, the Missouri Compromise, slavery below a certain line, freedom above it, that's ruled off the table by Dred Scott. So the Dred Scott decision, rendered by 7 Democrat appointees over the 2 non-Democrats, is now a very extreme version of the Jacksonian project, a very extreme pro-slavery by the mid-1850s. And Douglas is trying to be sort of more moderate than that, but that's what it's come to. And Lincoln is running against, powerfully, Dred Scott.
Sean, explain why Dred Scott is bad. People know that it's bad, but have a hard time explaining why. Give us the 3-sentence version of why Dred Scott is bad.
Oh, boy.
This is a challenge. This is a little assignment here.
The obiter dicta, the idea that blacks are not, that blacks have no rights to which any white man is bound to respect. It's obiter dicta, it's dicta, but it's there. Right? Basically, it says that the Missouri Compromise was null and void when it was passed.
Yeah.
What that means is that Congress has no power to deal with the territories of the states. Right? That is the nub of the question. That is the nub of the constitutional question and of the political question all the way along. What can Congress do and what can't Congress do? And Taney says it can do nothing, absolutely nothing. Slavery can be brought anywhere. And if you don't think it can be brought in the North, there were cases that were in the courts at that point, the Lemon case in New York, that would have very much made that possible. Lincoln said it perfectly. The nation's going to be all half slave or half free. What the Taney decision opened up was the possibility of it being it's neither going to be half slave or half free. It's only going to be one or the other. It's going to be all slave. That was what the Taney decision opened up.
And just the Lemon decision that Sean mentioned was a pending Supreme Court case about whether ships in transit from one slave port to another one. Believe it or not, the way to sometimes get from one southern port to another southern port was actually by first going to New York, and that was the O'Hare of airport, where you change your planes, so you change ships. So can New York prohibit slavery on ships anchored in the port of New York? And the Supreme Court was maybe about to say, no, it can't do that.
Right.
And now you're just like this close from saying Massachusetts can't prohibit slavery. People have a constitutional right to take their slaves, their property, wherever they want. And Lincoln says, you went to bed thinking that Kansas was going to be free soil, and you're going to wake up with Illinois as slave soil.
Right. Back to the first sentence. So we're having a debate about the scope of congressional power, but also about the constitutional status of equality. Lincoln says the nation was conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, and yet neither the original Constitution nor the Bill of Rights contains the word equality. Why? Was that because of slavery? And was it an omission that it took the Civil War to remedy?
Yeah, I would say so.
Absolutely. I mean, conceived is the key word there. He's talking about the Declaration. He's not talking about the Constitution. He's talking about the Declaration. But the Declaration is the founding document of the country. And so everything that flows out of, everything subsequent must flow out of that declaration. That's really what he's doing. It's a certain amount of legerdemain. I mean, there's a certain amount of trickery going on here on Lincoln's part, historical trickery. But you can make a case, I think you can make the case, that there is an organic connection, that one must reflect the other.
And eventually, and now the connection, see, Lincoln's just saying this, but now it's in the text. So Lincoln's it works on so many different levels, you know. It's in 273 words, it's well done. But, you know, it's a meditation on many things, a meditation on life and death. You know, this is a cemetery. Bodies are being put in the ground, and we end with this. Begins with imageries of conception and birth. You know, conceived and our fathers brought forth. You know, in a birth image, and it ends with a call for a new birth of freedom, and it can work religiously and in other ways. So. How does the text of our Constitution, not Lincoln's, sort of codify this vision? The 14th Amendment, which he didn't live to see, but really is a posthumous tribute to Mr. Lincoln, begins, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, ... are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now let me read it to you again with emphasis on the key word. All persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. When I'm born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, my parents aren't citizens, but I'm still born a citizen just like the rest of everyone else. I'm born free and equal. We are all born equal thanks to the 14th Amendment. We are all created equal, so to speak. It is now a textual codification in the Constitution that harks back through Lincoln's reinterpretation of the words that Jefferson penned. All men are created equal. Now, the key word is born. It's a new birth of freedom. We're all free and equal at birth. And so now the texts actually are much more, you know, organically connected because we, Americans, are ratifying Lincoln's reinterpretation of Lincoln and of Jefferson and putting that, and the Declaration, and putting that explicitly in a new Bill of Rights that reads differently than the old one.
Okay, that's the beautiful transition to our second big idea, and that's a new birth of freedom. Sean, what did Lincoln have in mind when when he said a new birth of freedom? Was he thinking of constitutional amendments? Was he thinking of?
He was thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation, which many people have thought did nothing or did little, was merely a military operation. The Emancipation Proclamation, signed January 1st, 1863, had transformed the Army of the United States, the Union Army, into an army of liberation.
Yes.
Wherever the U.S. Army went, the slaves were freed. He did not intend for the Union Army to lose. He intended for the Union Army to win. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation was a proclamation of prospective emancipation. It was going to take some time. We were going to have to beat the rebels. We were going to have to crush secession. We were going to reclaim the Union. But when it happened, the slaves would be freed, according to the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he knew that it was going to take the 13th Amendment as well. But that was what was on his mind that afternoon 150 years ago. And the idea of a new birth. You know, America's born again.
Yes.
Now, Lincoln was not a particularly religious man, but he understood the uses of words, and he understood that America was going through a spiritual transfiguration. It was not just going to be a legalistic thing. America was transforming its very soul, and that's what's on his mind too. But it very much has to do with the emancipation of the ending of slavery. That's what the New Birth of Freedom is about.
Could I ask a question about that? Because I would have said that he's not a conventional churchgoer, but my sense is that he is deeply spiritual and religious. So say a little bit more about that. That was
spiritual.
interesting.
He does go to the New York Presbyterian Church when he gets to Washington, especially after his son dies. He becomes very much closer to that. But there's never in much sense that he had belief in the divinity of Christ, for example. You know, the common Christian things that you would associate. There's not much sense of that. Does he have a sense of the grandeur of a world beyond our capacity to understand, let alone control. Absolutely. That's spiritual life. So I think he had a very deep spiritual life, which he would express in the best way he knew how, which is in the King James language. There is no greater language, there are other languages, but there's no greater language to express it than that. So that's where I think he's coming from. I think the argument about Lincoln's religion is kind of off base if you don't see it that way.
Now, Akhil, let me ask about Lincoln and the 14th Amendment. Yes. Sean says that a new birth of freedom was thinking forward to the Emancipation Proclamation, and it took the 13th Amendment to codify that. Yes. Lincoln didn't live when the 14th Amendment, which contains the equality guarantees that you read, was passed. Were the framers of the 14th Amendment thinking back to Lincoln? Did Lincoln anticipate that it would take a constitutional amendment to guarantee a constitutional equality? What were his constitutional thoughts on that?
Yes, so let me just take the story back to 1860 and the election. The Republican Party platform is, read our lips, no new slavery, no slavery in the territories, but they actually say, we respect the right of each state to control its domestic institutions, which is code for, among other things, slavery. So they're not proposing to mess with slavery where it exists. They just want to stop its spread. It's a cancer. You first have to stop it from growing, and then eventually you can hope that the cancer will recede, because if all the new states, if the territories are free soil, and they eventually come into the Union as free states, well, then eventually you're going to be able to contain slavery. It's a kind of, it's the domino effect idea to think about.
And if you get enough states in that are free, you can abolish it by constitutional amendment.
Exactly.
It's simple.
Exactly. So that's the platform of 1860. And early in the war, and when Lincoln says at his first inaugural, the very day, the day before Lincoln is inaugurated, the outgoing Congress proposes an amendment saying, no future amendment shall empower Congress to get rid of slavery where it exists. And Lincoln says in his inauguration, I haven't read this thing, but I have no objection to it.
What the hell? Right.
We ran on a platform of no new slavery in the territories, and we're not proposing to mess with slavery in the states. That's not. And the war initially is not a war to end slavery. It's a war merely for union, and if he makes it about a radical cause like slavery, he's gonna lose the middle states that he absolutely needs to have on his side. Remember, there are slave states that have not seceded: Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland. And West Virginia is going to break off from Virginia, and he's got to keep those states, because that's his margin. He once very famously says, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. And if he starts being Mr. Abolitionist early in the war, this is just going to push away the moderates, the Andrew Johnsons of the world, the war Democrats whose support he needs from Tennessee. And the Emancipation changes all of this, the Emancipation Proclamation. It redefines, wars are fought for purposes. They're not just senseless slaughters. You actually have a war aim, and this is what clausets mean. You win the war when you achieve your purpose, not just when the other side flees the battlefield. It's about doing things, and the purpose originally is just the Union, to restore the Union. But by 1863, or 62, when he promises to do this in September, after Antietam, the preliminary emancipation, and then January 1st, 1863, he's now saying, no, this war is now a different kind of war. It's a war that's connected up with slavery in a way that it wasn't actually. That wasn't our initial war aim. I'm really glad to hear Sean say, because I wasn't sure whether, when he's saying a new birth of freedom, because he doesn't say slavery as such, it's a beautiful political speech that could mean certain very grand and expansive things to the idealists, but could be read in a more tame way. It's subtle. New birth of freedom.
But if you're talking about freedom, you're always talking about slavery.
Great. Well, I'm glad. I always hoped that that's what he meant.
That's what I think. Yeah.
But there is a beautiful political ambiguity about it. But by 1864, see, because this is the beginning of the campaign, just like Jack Kennedy is going down to Dallas in late November to launch the campaign and mend fences. He's got to win Texas. Lincoln has to win Pennsylvania. You know, he hopes to have God on his side, but he must have Pennsylvania in the re-election. And southern Pennsylvania, as you know, is pretty southern. And so the 1864 platform of the Republican Party, very different than 1860. It says we're going to get rid of slavery by constitutional amendment everywhere. Because the Emancipation, at best, only promises that these people will be free, and indeed forever free, once the Union Army advances. But it doesn't say, actually, that they'll be free in the northern states that have never been in rebellion. It doesn't say that you can't bring in new slaves or, you know, reintroduce slavery. You're going to need something more than mere presidential action in time of war without even a congressional statute explicitly saying the same thing, because that's all the Emancipation is an executive order, a decree. So you're going to need something more, and the Republican platform in 1864 tells you what more. We are going to introduce an amendment to get rid of slavery. And the Democrat platform sounds like the Republican platform of 1860, the Union as it was. So there's an election on just this, and I'm really glad to hear that Sean thinks that he's announcing, in effect, that's the new platform in 64 in November, because this is the beginning of the campaign to some extent. It's many things. And yes, we're going to get a 13th Amendment. And you saw how Lincoln, in the lame duck, arm twists and he needs to get some Democrats on board for that, and how he does that. And then the question is whether the 13th Amendment is enough. Lincoln dies before that really becomes a key point. Had he lived, maybe things would have been done to some extent by statute. But here's the big thing that you do need at least one more amendment to do. They didn't quite figure it all out. This is a work in progress. The minute you end slavery everywhere by a constitutional amendment, the South, when it wants to come back into the Union, remember, they've absented them. They're boycotting. You know, they're trying to pull a shutdown. Yeah, the South tries to pull shutdowns. That's how, you know, the white South, the conservative white South, that's what it does. When it sees it's losing, but now, here's the problem. When they come back in, if you've ended slavery, they don't come back in with 3/5 of all the blacks who don't vote down south. They come in with 5/5. They're going to actually have more voting power in Congress. Thanks to the 13th Amendment, you know, unless you do something else, they're going to have more clout in the new Congress than they had in the old. So they didn't sort of work all that through, but you need at least one more amendment to deal with that fact. Because the blacks aren't going to be voting down south, you know, in 1866, but they're now free. They've been freed by the 13th Amendment. They're forever free by the emancipation of the 13th Amendment. And so now the South says, okay, we're ready to come back. And by the way, we want more seats than we had before.
Great. We've talked about the founders' version of liberty and equality. We've talked about the new birth of liberty and equality. And now we have to talk about democracy. So here's the relevant phrase, and it's familiar to all of us. We here highly resolve, those dead shall not have died in vain, that the nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Sean, what did Lincoln mean by government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and what incredibly contested debates about the meaning of democracy and popular sovereignty was he resolving?
Yeah, I mean, he's talking about democracy.
Yeah.
He's talking about the third war aim, which historians don't talk enough about. One war aim was union, crush secession, the essence of anarchy. The second was, eventually, slavery. But the third was democracy. Remember how the Civil War began. I mean, it began with the election of a president, a constitutional election of a president. A section of the country would not abide by that democratic solution, so it withdrew. It was a slap in the face of democracy. It was telling democracy, we're going to take our, stuff and go home. We have nothing to do with you. On trial is, this goes back to the world thing before, on trial is whether a democratic nation is possible, whether democracy is possible. Democracy is on the run around the world. This is the testing ground.
Yes.
So that's what he's talking about. But the Civil War had always been about that. In sometime early on in 1861, he says that that's what the nub of the question is, whether, in fact, democracy can operate.
Correct.
So that's really the other war aim, is to vindicate democracy. And he makes that very, very clear. And that's what he's announcing. I think that's the most important thing, actually, that's going on in the Gettysburg Address, is that pronouncement about government of the people, by the people, and for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Not just perish in America, but perish everywhere. Those are the stakes.
What does he mean by democracy? This is not African-American suffrage. He's talking about something else.
Of course. He is talking that a majority rule of the citizenry, of popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty not in the way that James Wilson necessarily would have meant it in 1787, 88. By now, the political system has expanded. Democracy is always being fought over and changed. Don't get me wrong. And he would have a much more limited view of, say, black citizenship in 1863 than he might have in 1865. But nevertheless, he means that for those people who are entitled to be part of the polity, part of the citizenry, they are finally the sovereign. They are finally those who make the decisions about what the government will be doing, who will be elected.
So he means a majority of people of the United States shall govern and secession is unconstitutional, or he's saying something else?
Well, secession is unconstitutional from the get-go. From the get-go. I mean, it is a, as Andrew Jackson said, actually, in crushing John C. Calhoun in 1833, the government of the United States is a government, not a league. Not a league of states that kind of get together and can kind of jump at any time they want. No, it's a government that was set up by we, the people of the United States.
Now, this is the argument, or I should say the wonderful discussion that I had with Akhil as a first-year law student more than 20 years ago in your office, Akhil, and I told our friends in the audience that this is what got me excited about the Constitution, this very argument. And I came in, and Akhil was busy, and he had said in class, for the first day of class or something, obviously, James Wilson was right. We, the people of the United States, were sovereign from the time of the founding, and therefore efforts by we, the people of individual states, to secede was unconstitutional because it was against the majority rule. And I said with the great overconfidence of a young law student, that was absolutely not settled. It's obvious, it's completely obvious from Federalist 39 that Madison sees both the people of each state and the people of the United States as dual sovereigns, and it took antietam, it took the Civil War itself to resolve that question definitively, that we, the people of the United States and not of the individual states, were sovereign. Let's not delight the audience by rehearsing our week-long debate.
It's called reenactment. You've heard of reenactors? They're going to reenact this.
Exactly. Far less compelling than the president. But Akhil, just describe how there are arguments on both sides of this. Yes. And what did Lincoln have in mind when he said?
And if I could just say by way of a thank you back. So if that conversation inspired you, I have to tell the audience that what inspires a teacher is to have amazing and spirited students taking seriously their obsessions and pushing back as hard as they are able. Sean mentioned that Lincoln has said before that the essence of this is about, even before Gettysburg, it's about democracy. I think he says it as early as his special session address to Congress. He calls Congress back in session. He's inaugurated, and when he is inaugurated in March, a bunch of states, 7, have purported to secede, but hostilities have not really broken out. That's in early March. In mid-April, Sumter is bombarded. War is on in earnest. He calls up troops and does a whole bunch of things unilaterally because he's the only one in town. The Congress isn't in session. And then some more states, the Upper South, purports to secede, including Virginia. He immediately, while taking all these unilateral actions, calls Congress back into session. What day do they, just take a guess. What day do you think he says, I need you back in the Capitol by? And he announces this in mid-April, and we don't have, jet travel. So what would be the iconic date? He says, we all have to meet on July 4th. July 4th, back to the Declaration, okay? And he says this is essentially a people's contest, that the question is, and now he's defining, government of the people and majorities. He says it's a constitutional majority. He's a law person. So it's not everyone. This is defined by law. And we have rules about who can vote and how they're tallied up. And yes, I only got 39 point some % of the popular vote in that 4-way election. But I won the proper constitutional majority. I played by the legal rules. We have legal rules and we have to play by them. We have ballots. And once ballots have fairly determined a proposition, they cannot be undone by bullets. This is what he's saying. Democracy can't exist if people who lose an election fair and square try to set it at naught, to undo it by force of arms. He says, you know, even in his inaugural address, you don't like me, wait 4 years and vote me out, but you can't take up arms against a duly elected constitutional government, because if you do, then we just have, then there's an end. Now, his view also presupposes that because actually the rebels have a bunch in common with him. They think that a majority has to binds the minority. They think, though, that the relevant unit is South Carolina. Not even in South Carolina, not everyone is in favor of secession, or in Virginia, but the rebel position is, look, within each state, majority governs the minority within that state. And Lincoln says no. So it's democracy and union together. It's the United States as a whole that governs, because we are a constitution and not a mere league or confederacy. Here's the best, and believe it or not, one person who very much agrees with Lincoln on this point is a guy from Pennsylvania, probably I think one of our 2 worst presidents ever, and that's saying something, James Buchanan from southern Pennsylvania. And Buchanan he says, it's unconstitutional, but what do you want me to do about it?
I can't do anything about it.
Yeah,
right.
But here's, just in one sentence, amazing argument that Buchanan says. The Constitution was a very close-fought proposition, ratification of the Constitution in 1787-88. It barely gets through in New York and Massachusetts and Virginia and other places. Show me one person, says Buchanan, who in this entire year says, listen, if you don't like it, you can always leave, money-back guarantee. Boy, this would have been a pretty good, if it's true that if you don't like it, you can leave, why don't the supporters of the thing say so? Because that would have persuaded a lot of doubters. Just give it a try, and not a single person. So this is, I just proved that Lincoln is right, you see. Just one little factor, amazingly coming from Buchanan. If the deal was you could leave, show me one person who says that. One person. No one has ever done so. Okay? That's pretty stunning. We've had this debate for a long time. No one's ever. And James Madison, actually, in New York, the New York ratification is very close. The eyes of the world are upon New York. This is like, like the fiscal cliff negotiations or something. Are we going to default or not? Or the debt ceiling? And everyone's looking. And it's, in the end, it's ratified in New York, 30-27. This close. One person changes the vote. And actually, believe it or not, because you might think you need 2 to switch, but actually one person that becomes 29-28, the chair then gets to vote, make a tie-making vote, and the chair is actually opposed to ratification. It fails 29-29, through by one vote in New York. And the supporters of the Constitution, or they don't know if they have the votes here. The opponents say, listen, we'll vote for the thing on the condition that we get a Bill of Rights. This is very tempting. But they think about it and say, no, we actually can't go for that deal because it's all sales are final. You're in or you're out. James Madison writes a letter to the New York Convention. And at a time when everything is turning on this, because if New York says no, the Constitution is a practical matter. It's hard to work, without New York. Here's what James Madison says when the Constitution is being adopted. The Constitution must be ratified, quote, in toto and forever. That's how it's been ratified by all the other states, and it must be ratified that way or not at all in New York. So I'm with Mr. Lincoln on this. I don't think that was clear in 1776. Lincoln sometimes talks as if all this was established in 1776, but in 1776 I think we actually are a mere alliance, league, confederation, treaty. And indeed, when the Constitution is adopted, Rhode Island initially peels off, and so does North Carolina. We had secession in the very act of Constitution, but we basically said not again. Once you're in, you're in. You don't have to join Rhode Island. You can go your own way. You don't have to join North Carolina, but once you're in because we are a union.
Excellent. Well, I won't do the full rebuttal again, but just to say that many acknowledge that although there was a strong argument like that, it wasn't settled until the Civil War itself, that we, the people of the United States, were sovereign. This has been superb. We have a bunch of great questions, and I'm going to take them now. The first one relates to the conversation we've just been having. Does the panel have any comments on the states that are now talking and voting about leaving the U.S. and becoming their own countries? Is secession constitutional today?
No. Well, I mean, the Supreme Court's actually said this, right? In
Texas versus White.
Texas v. White makes it clear. So it's not even a question of having to struggle over it. I think it's, look, I do think that the spirit of John C. Calhoun is abroad in the land once again. Yes. And you do see this political theory. It's not that it's ever gone away.
And in the sense in which the question is probably meant, the answer is emphatically no, but there are two ways in which you actually can have secession. So I just want to offer this to my dissatisfied fellow citizens. In your hands, not mine, Mr. Lincoln says, lies the momentous question of civil war. My dissatisfied fellow citizens, one, if you don't like it, you can leave. You can secede. God be with you. You don't get to take the land and the water with you. You don't get to take, the NASA sites that we all bled for, okay? And we need to, and that's geostrategically important that actually we have southern bases so we can launch things into space. So you can leave. That's a form of secession. Lincoln has no objection to it, and I have none today. Second, you actually can have secession, taking the land and the water, the state, because it's the law of the land with you, as long as you get the rest of us to agree. And Lincoln himself says, well, listen, if it's by mutual consent, well, of course, things that are now part of Canada used to be part of Maine, and we actually, by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, peeled them up. Polk is claiming 54-40. That's way up into what's now Canada, but we actually, so stuff that's U.S. territory can be ceded, but can't be grabbed unilaterally merely by a state. We'd all have to agree on that. And if we all agree, Lincoln would say that's government of the people, by the people, for the people of the Union as a whole. And in fact, he says, as a practical matter, you want to secede? Vote for a pro-secession president next time around, and as a practical matter, he may let the South go. But that would be a national a conversation, an election, a referendum of sorts on the question. It can't be done unilaterally.
Good. That relates to this next excellent question. Please comment on the use of that government of instead of just the nation in the last sentence. Why did he say government of the people and not the nation?
Well, I think when he's talking about the nation, he's mostly talking about union. When he's talking about democracy, he's talking about government. Democracy is a form of government. And it's not about the union, it's not about our nation, it's about all nations. So hence he's using that language of government. Because not every government is the United States, but every country has a government. And that government can be democratic or it can be autocratic. And he is talking in those terms. I think that's the reason.
And not just the officials, the government in that sense, but governance.
Yes.
Just a system by which we collectively govern ourselves, by which we resolve disputes through ideally law and peaceful procedures. But elections, and the South basically doesn't want to accept an election, by free speech, and the South has shut down free speech. They made it a crime down South to criticize slavery. Abraham Lincoln gets 0 popular, not electoral, popular votes south of Virginia in 1860. Okay, they've shut down free speech that much. So Lincoln is saying what government is about are fair elections and free speech and court cases and petitions, and that's how we govern ourselves.
I have to ask again, because I'm unsettled in my mind, and I don't want to leave without this follow-up. Again, what is he talking about when he says democratic government? Is he saying the Union will be destroyed and that is the end of an important democracy? Why is it that the North losing the war would end government of and for and by the people?
Because the war was brought on as a result of a democratic procedure. That democratic procedure was repudiated by the rebels, by the Confederates. If a nation, if a democratic government rather, can be hijacked and destroyed, in effect, by malcontents, then democracy has failed.
And that's true even and he says the essence of this is anarchy, right. Because, then can parts of Virginia secede from Virginia, and if you're in that seceded part, can you secede, in your own city and then your own neighborhood? And so he basically says you have to set up ground rules about voting and free speech and dispute resolution with courts. There are always going to be debates about these things, but we have to agree in advance these issues are going to be decided democratically. Again, fair elections, free speech, and courts. You're not doing any of those things. You're appealing to guns.
But it does rest on this proposition that we, the people of the whole country, are
correct.
sovereign. And if all of us agreed to it, it would be fine.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And that was the procedure that had been followed constitutionally in 1860.
All right.
So they're repudiating that.
So you see this discussion that Akhil and I had 20 years ago. This is at the core, really, of Lincoln's strong claim about democracy. And it was a bold claim then, and it was contested, and that was the third thing that makes this address so transformative
And there are people
constitutionally.
today who contest that Barack Obama was born in America, okay? There are always nut jobs in the world, and it's a mistake to try to kill them all. So you have to deal with them, but you deal with them, Lincoln is saying, constitutionally with elections and speech and courts. And the courts were open, and the South did not avail themselves of that. You know, and the Congress was open, and the election actually had been skewed against Lincoln in at least two ways. The Electoral College was tilted toward the South in all sorts of ways, thanks to the 3/5 clause. And Lincoln, his name wasn't even allowed, you know, to appear on the ballot, or frankly, people, as a practical matter, weren't allowed to vote for him without being horsewhipped or lynched or something else. So he says that's how, you know, we're going to disagree. The essence of life on this earth is that people will disagree, but we have to resolve our disputes through constitutional mechanisms.
Wonderful. Now I think I begin to understand it. Speaking of President Obama, a questioner asks, why do you think so many presidents have avoided Gettysburg Address commemorations? President Obama did not appear at Gettysburg.
He didn't appear at Gettysburg, yeah. What other presidents have done so? I guess Kennedy didn't show up in November. He went to Dallas. He would have been better off at Gettysburg. I just don't know the answer to the question.
It invites unflattering comparisons.
Well, that's true. No one could be anywhere near as eloquent.
I know Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln was a friend of mine, and you are no Abe Lincoln.
Right.
And this is why, until FDR, the two-term tradition, you know, you're trying to get a third term, people, of course, going to say, you think you're greater than General Washington and Jackson and, you know, all these others who stepped down after two terms? So it invites, you know, unflattering comparisons.
I think President Lincoln himself can illuminate us about this matter. Yes, sir. Why is it that your successors have avoided Gettysburg?
Well, it's a practical decision on their part, truly, that who would want to go there and say something and then have to go and say, well, that was nice, but it just wasn't good. It is traditionally Mr. Lincoln's day, and no other president would want to stand in that particular limelight. So, but he had his day, and I'll take the day off, put my feet up, and have everybody else do it.
You are indeed a hard act to follow, sir. I have two other short questions that you may be able to answer as well. Did you think that you made a good speech?
I hoped that I made a good speech. It was my intention to try in a few words, which would be very quickly copied and sent to newspapers that everybody might see them, to explain what it was all about. And
That's the Harpo Marx Lincoln.
I think it can be summed up by what Mr. Everett said after the program to Lincoln, I believe in a letter, that he said, I flatter myself that I could have said in 2 hours and come as close to the point of the whole day, the whole question, as you came in 2 minutes. So I believe by that estimation it was a success. I did say my say and underline the points, and the people would have that to look to when they have questions about why are we still fighting this war? Why is this slaughter allowed to continue? Can't we get this over with? No, we had a debt to people like George Washington and all the founders who suffered and were persecuted at the time of the Declaration and the Revolution. We owed them a debt. They risked their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor to bring forth this country. And who are we to say, well, it ain't working out, we're going to throw it away and start over? No, we had a debt to history and the future to stay the course and make sure that government of the people, by the people, and for the people would not vanish.
Sir, two other very short questions. Why weren't you the featured speaker at Gettysburg, and did you really write the speech on the back of the envelope?
As far as being the featured speaker, it was at the time a tradition and a custom and a social convention for a big event to feature a great speaker. That was the entertainment of the day. People would flock to see gentlemen like Mr. Everett. He was renowned as a speaker, an accomplished man. People would go to see 5 hours worth of Shakespeare and be glad to get it. 2-3 hour operas. They had much more patience in those days. And they'd stand for the whole thing. In Shakespeare's time, they stood in the yard of the Globe and watched Henry V have at it for hours and hours. It was their entertainment. And they wanted this man to come and give the featured talk in which he explained the entire battle, chapter and verse, all that happened, and its effects. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was a fine speech. I congratulated him afterwards. They invited me, it's sort of an afterthought. They felt that they should make an effort to invite the president after all, the commander-in-chief. But they, I think, were thinking that I would not accept, that the more important things to do. And I did. The important thing I had to do was get my 2 cents in, as it were, to explain what it all meant so that everybody would understand. Everett was telling the adventure stories about the battle. I needed to put into words what it all really meant to everybody. So I jumped at the opportunity to go do this. As to writing it, I was invited officially on the 2nd of November, so I had a couple of weeks of reading time to collect my thoughts. I knew pretty much what I wanted to say, and drawn from the literature that I appreciated, the works of Shakespeare and the Bible, the great poets of the past. I knew what moved me. And in my experience as a speaker, I knew what worked in the speech and what did not work in the speech, and in which manner and in which presentation would make the most heartfelt effect on people. So, I wrote it on White House stationery and continued to improve it and take out a word, bring a comma here and there until the morning of. The phrase on God, I interpolated on the speech. It was not on my initial draft. So, no, none of the back of the novel. If you've ever ridden on one of those trains, you can't get anybody done. You want to get me a whole lot of your teeth. I took what time I had, and was fortunate enough to find the right thoughts and say the right things. Once in a while, you come up with a piece of literature that really enthralls the public. This poet did with this poem about a raven. You're lucky if you get one bit like that in your career. And I was fortunate to have that particular bit at the particular time.
Thank you so much, sir. We're honored by your presence. Well, unlike the speeches of Everett, Town Hall Tuesdays cannot go on forever, so I'm going to ask each of our panelists one final question, which is the obvious one. We've talked about the founders' vision of liberty and equality, the new birth of freedom, the meaning of democracy. Sum up, as concisely as possible, Lincoln's constitutional achievement.
Well, Lincoln's constitutional achievement was to define and to lead the preservation of the United States of America, which is the Constitution itself. It was under great stress and strain. It was being attacked from without. It was being attacked from within. And he led the forces that preserved this country. That's number one. Number two, by the time he died, the country was on the precipice of what he had announced at Gettysburg, which was a new birth of freedom. And in those 3 great amendments, the first of which, as we know from Steven Spielberg, he had a lot to get through. In a sense, the Constitution was rewritten in fundamental ways. And those three amendments, I think, are his greatest constitutional legacy, even though he did not live long enough to see them through.
Great. Akhil?
Yes, I would want it remembered that just hours before his death, he did publicly say that he was in favor of black suffrage. It's something that he had written privately about, but he went public on at an address in the White House. John Wilkes Booth was in the audience, and it is said by many that at that moment he actually said to the fellow next to him, his partner in crime, that, okay, we're going to do him in now. We call them the framers. We have architectural metaphors. We call them the framers, but the house that they built, great men though they were, was a house divided against itself. And that's punning on the word house, because the house can also mean a family, like the house of Atreus or something like that. But a house divided against a house divided against itself cannot stand, and it didn't. It fell. And we call that the Civil War, and we call what happened afterwards the Reconstruction. And so I would say, my friends, he didn't just preserve the Union, as Sean mentioned, he also transformed it, he rebuilt it. You and I live in a Constitution. We really live far more in Lincoln's Constitution, in his house, than we do in even George Washington's or Thomas Jefferson's or James Madison's. Just here's one way to see that. Think about some important case that comes to mind about liberty and equality, some Bill of Rights case that pops into your head. And you're going to call it a Bill of Rights case, but my claim is 90% likelihood that that's not a Bill of Rights case at all, because the Bill of Rights only limited the federal government. The cases that you're thinking about are cases where states and localities have done bad things, or equality has been breached, and equality isn't a word in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights begins saying Congress shall make no law of a certain sort, and ends with the 10th Amendment. You know, the Tea Party folks say, yes, Congress shall make no law, period. You see, but the original Bill of Rights is a localist Tea Party document, way more. We don't live in that Constitution. We live in Lincoln's. So the cases that you were thinking about are cases which Lincoln is the center. They're cases like Brown versus Board of Education, or Mapp versus Ohio State, Miranda versus Arizona, Lawrence versus Texas, Bowers versus Harder. There are cases in which states and localities have misbehaved or equality has been violated. That's what we call the Bill of Rights. That is not the original Bill of Rights so much, which doesn't mention equality and doesn't restrict state and local governments. That's Lincoln's Bill of Rights. That's his new birth of freedom. That's the heart of the 14th Amendment. I read you the first sentence, but it goes on to say states can't misbehave, and it adds the word equality. We live in the house that the framers laid, but that fell, and that Lincoln we rebuilt. We live in Mr. Lincoln's house. And I think today, of all days, it's altogether fitting and proper that we remember that and pay tribute to him.
Boy, this was a great conversation. This is our second Town Hall Tuesday. I can't imagine a more historically meaningful one. The next one is on December 10th at noon. Please join us for that. Find out what the topic is a week or so in advance. The best way to find out is to sign up for our newsletter and become a member. You can join our 1787 Society, and I think now we're going to have to create an 1863 Society as well. Most of all, I just want to thank these two inspiring teachers of history and the Constitution, Sean Wilentz and Akhil Amar. Thank you, and President Lincoln. Thank you so much. Great, and please do go down and see the exhibit. It's great, and you'll see Abraham Lincoln's original autograph signed the day of Gettysburg.
Wow.
Wonderful. Superb.